So welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to talk about all the things you need to know before you begin a file and object data migration. I'm joined by my colleague today, Ben Henry. I'm just going to stop the slides here for a minute so that you can actually see that we are real live people. Ben,
yeah,
give us an
sure. So I
introduction.
kind of started my career in the network world, designing LANs, WANs, and implementing those across the globe. And that transitioned into life sciences. Life sciences, I spent a little over 16 years, anywhere from application development to database administration, SQL, Oracle, MySQL. In there, I actually kind of specialized in disaster recovery, which paid off immensely during Hurricane Sandy and other small disasters along the way. Which then led into a role into the actual data protection and disaster recovery world for the organization globally. And then from there, that transitioned into storage. From storage, I then now have a position here with Komprise today, and I'm here to talk to you about migrations.
Nice.
And some of the things I've learned over the years.
Exactly. So it's kind of funny. I've got a Hurricane Sandy horror story as well. I'm Steve Perchinowski, Director of Product Marketing here at Komprise. And between Ben and I, we've been at this a long time. You know, it's like we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. Today is absolutely live, right? So please put your questions in the chat. We are more than happy to answer them. And, full disclosure, right? We work for Komprise, but the things we're going to talk about today are going to be valuable whether you choose another enterprise migration solution or if you go with free tools, right? These are basic lessons learned. Some of these, are hard lessons that we learned from experience. And, Ben, glad to have you on the team. I know you've been doing some amazing stuff for our customers. So let me jump back into the slides here and we will go ahead and kick it off. So this is actually a series of webinars. So the last time Darren and I talked about smart data migration, which is really about Komprise's specific approach to how we do migrations. Again, today is going to be all about know before you go. So these lessons learned. And then on the 21st, we'll be joined by our founder and COO, Krishna, and she's going to talk about cloud native access, why it is and why it's so important. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into today's webinar. So Ben, I think this is not new news to anybody, but how is the explosive data growth affecting the way people do migrations?
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at just storage spend and storage growth over the last 5 years, I mean, storage itself as a technology has come down, flash has come down, but the data has just grown exponentially. If you just go look at your budgets 5 years ago versus today, it's almost jaw dropping. And some of the things that we're not considering is what are we actually doing with that data? Is it prime time live data that needs to be on high performance storage, or is it something that could be on a lower tier storage?
That makes sense. I mean, so, I know in the past for me personally, and a lot of customers, they wouldn't do migrations until, that 3 to 5 year mark when their storage vendor essentially forced them. Do you see people doing things more frequently or, more options are kind of driving more action?
Yeah, that's actually very true. You called it out that the traditional model was let me go out and buy something. I'm going to stay there for 5, 7, 10 years. I'm going to stay on the technology. Maybe I'll stay on it till it's no longer supported, and then I'm scrambling to find something to replace it. I'm actually seeing with today where individuals are going more with a pay-as-you-go model or software as a service or hardware as a service, and they're going month to month or year to year, and they're pivoting much sooner than a traditional, I'll just say 5-year model.
Yeah. So cost can be a driver too, right? Instead of like my stuff is end of life, or it can also be about cost, right? This thing is too expensive.
Absolutely. You could adopt a new model. Let's say it's hardware as a service. You're bound by a 1-year contract. You get into that and realize you didn't see the full picture getting into it. So now it's like, wait, after a year, I spent how much on the storage platform? I have to do something now. So yeah, you see the pivots much sooner.
Yeah, I agree. I think the costs are much more obvious today than maybe they were in the past. So Ben, let's take this one. This is all about having a plan.
Absolutely. I mean, having a plan is the biggest part of this. And without planning, you're kind of setting yourself up for disaster. We talk about that the size and the scale of the data. I mean, it can be petabytes of data. It can be billions of files, large, small. Migrations, let's face it, they can be disruptive. They can be just something that you're just absolutely dreading. And the goal is to not make it that way. The goal is to get everyone into a position where they have data portability, and it doesn't take a year to plan to get there. Across the industry, there's many statistics out there that as much of 80% of your data is technically cold. So why bring that with you? Why have to constantly pivot that when you're moving your data that's really expensive that needs to be on high performing storage? We'll talk about some options, which tier, which cloud, which approach. We're going to cover rules versus regulations, data types and workloads, and why do they matter? Another one that's most common is, why is my migration painfully slow? What is going on? I need more insight into this. Do I really need to test? We're talking about free and point tools versus an enterprise solution, and a communications plan. I think this is one of the areas that's largely ignored, is your communications plan, but we're going to talk about some simple ways to make it effective where people will actually read it.
So for communications plan, it's, migrations are very much a team sport, is kind of what you're saying, right? So you definitely need to make sure you pull all your stakeholders in.
Yeah, absolutely. And even leadership, you want to make sure that everyone, that this communication is inclusive. You effectively commute one time, and not 3 or 4 different emails based on stakeholders versus operations versus senior leadership. Just get one all-inclusive email, make it simple for you and everyone else to read.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical.
All right, so we talked about, where are you going? Where are you coming from? And this list is by no means inclusive. It's not a plug for anybody. It's just some quick logos that everyone should recognize, but understand there are more. And when you build your plan, you want to have a solid plan of where are you coming from and where you're going. Maybe you are the decision maker. Maybe it's something that was handed down to you from senior leadership that says, here's point A, here's point B, make it happen. Or everyone knows what point A is, and you have to go through and evaluate these technologies. So up front, don't get down to the last minute. No one wants to be up to 4 a.m. before a migration trying to make sure everything's wired correctly or there's a communications gap. Is you want to understand point A, point B, and you want to have that in place long before your migration.
So with all these options, are we seeing more, kind of cross-vendor migrations? Or people kind of less loyal to their storage vendor than they were in the past?
Yeah, great question. And I would say it's really about cost is what I'm seeing across the enterprise, and even small companies too, is where a shop might have been one vendor only. This is the way we're going to go forward. This is our future. To, what? It's been great, but I got to go now. So I'm seeing a lot of hybrid approach to how companies select their next storage. Is maybe they stay loyal to that vendor, but they buy less of it, or they say, what? It hasn't been fun. I'm going somewhere else. Or they need to adopt an object model into their current situation. So they've got NFS, SMB, and guess what? They have cloud native applications. So you have to bring in something object, or you partner with somebody who provides object storage for you.
I think it makes a lot of sense, right? And people are taking kind of a hybrid cloud approach. It makes sense that they would also have a hybrid storage approach, right? And I think with more tools available, you're probably not trapped by your current vendor anymore. Good point.
Yeah, very true. And it's one of those situations too, where not everyone is required to keep everything on premises anymore. Or you might have some sensitive data that has to stay there, so you have to keep a small presence of whatever technology that is.
Yeah, the maturity of cloud NAS is making a big difference.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk about some rules and regulations.
Yeah, absolutely. So rules versus regulations, and rules largely are set by your organization, by your company, by your internal teams, such as retention policy, legal hold, disaster recovery. Those are typically rules set by your organization that you have to adhere to versus regulations. Regulations are typically set by a governing body that sometimes can be associated with fines and other penalties. Some of the big ones out there, and again, by no means an inclusive list, just some ones that popped up to mind right away are Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, MA 201, GXP. GXP really stands for Good Practice Regulations. You'll hear a lot of times GMP, Good Manufacturing Practices, and GDPR. GDPR is one actually that people will go great lengths to avoid. They won't move data into specific regions because they don't want to deal with it. And this is a great time to talk about partnership, bringing in stakeholders, giving other people responsibilities in your migration. Don't put the whole weight of the migration on your shoulder. Partner with your teams, partner specifically with your legal teams, partner with your compliance teams. Talk about these things up front as part of your plan. Say, hey, you know what? I have this data. I need to move this. Is there anything I should be aware of? Put that on them. You may not be the person who owns the data. You're the one responsible for providing the storage, providing the plan, providing the migration, but you may not know what's in there. So put that back on the data owners. Say, I need you all in here. So what am I dealing with? What can we do? What can't we do? And know that up front.
That's a good point. So do have a question in the chat here. If I have to adhere to regulations, how can I ensure that how can I prove that I follow those regulations / audit log? Does that make sense? So he's asking, I guess, how do we audit these steps during a migration?
Absolutely. That's something we're going to get into about our tools and how we're going to select the criteria to go with what tool. So, quick preview into that is know what you're bound by, and that will actually help you drive a decision on how you're going to migrate.
That makes sense.
So I'll give you kind of an early preview to it, but we'll jump into that in one of our later slides here.
Perfect. Cool. Hey, thank you for the questions. Please, again, put a note in the chat, but ask your questions. Again, this is a great opportunity to talk to Ben with a ton of experience. So let's talk about data discovery. To me, this is kind of new versus what I used to see with migrations in the past.
Very true. A lot of times, I'm going to focus a lot on data discovery, using data discovery. So with data discovery versus without, we have the both columns, but I'm going to focus on the left side. Quickly talk about without, because I think we're all familiar without doing data discovery. It's simply a lift and shift. Sounds simple, and I have the word right with a bunch of question marks behind it because, yeah, okay, I have to take data from the left, move it to the right, and just go. Well, we've all tried that, and there's always some complexity. There's always unknown risks involved. A lot of times there can be rollbacks, there can be outages, there can be performance issues. So let's go over to data discovery with, when you do data discovery, you're going to gain those insights. You're going to understand your workloads. You're going to understand what speed bumps you're going to have in the process. Do you have large files? Do you have small files? Do you have hundreds of shares? Do you have thousands of shares? Of a lot of these data discovery tools, you have the ability to build a centralized index and searchability. Legal teams, compliance teams, they're going to love that. So guess what? Bring them in, help them pay for some of these tools so it doesn't come fully out of your budget, because when it comes to doing any kind of legal discovery or any compliance regulations and then moving data based on compliance regulations, guess what? They're involved. They have the ability to introduce self-service. Let them do what they need to do, and it reduces your workload.
So it's really, I'd say it's a collaboration opportunity, right? For the storage teams, infrastructure teams to collaborate with line of business.
It's going to be a common theme throughout this presentation is bring other individuals in, have them take on responsibilities so that you're not the one stuck with this all the time, because you can't answer all these questions. So empower them, give them the ability to actually make decisions as part of this, and just collaborate constantly.
Makes good sense.
Opportunity for standardization. When you do the discovery, you're going to find, is everything set up to my standards today? Or am I bringing along a lot of legacy standards, maybe through acquisitions or through mergers or different operations teams or lack of documentation? Do I have one parent share with 50 sub-shares, and we shouldn't be doing that? So this gives you an opportunity to kind of find those areas, find those speed bumps, and deal with them up front. And sometimes you can even deal with them during the migrations, because enterprise tools will give you the options. Do you want to carry those old permissions forward, or do you want to standardize and use the ones you're setting on your target? Protocols, everyone kind of knows about SMB, NFS, dual, but let's talk about like the dual versus mix, because this is another area that may not just provide a speed bump. This may actually cause a rollback. So when you have dual shares are typically both SMB and NFS, but one of the two protocols is primary that sets the permissions, and then the other one can observe or just provides read-only. Some technology vendors will let you do what is known as mixed. That's where both protocols can come in. Both protocols can set permissions. Both protocols can overwrite the other protocol's permissions. So now when you set up this migration, how do you even migrate it? And, in my experience, when you find these things, it was usually set up as a mistake. And actually, a lot of the vendors that offer this option highly discourage you from using it.
Interesting. Because it sounds like a great idea, right? I want to have, all the ways to access my data, but that's a lot of complexity.
It is, because it's just you constantly have this layering of permissions, and it's just like, who's the one that's setting them now? And then when you get to do that migration, which permission is going to move the data? So it's worth knowing those up front and finding them up front, and actually having the discussion with the teams that own that data. Do you really need this? Yes, without it.
So what you're saying is it's a really good opportunity to take a look and see, like, we've been doing this for a long time, but do we actually need to continue it? Is it still a good idea? So
correct. Just because we've been doing it that way doesn't mean it's the correct way to do it in the future. Maybe it is, but ask the questions. Do we really need to do this, or can we simplify this and standardize it? Absolutely.
Makes good sense.
We talked about implementing data governance based on rules and regulations. Again, we talked about the collaboration. Bring the individuals in, bring your legal team in, bring your compliance teams in, bring your application teams in, make them responsible, but give them the tools to do this themselves.
That makes sense.
Identification of orphaned data. This is another one where you have users that have left the organization, and home drives are notorious for this, where their Active Directory accounts no longer around. So what do you do with it? Do you even need to bring it with you? So a lot of times you'll see discovery tools have the option to find unresolved ownership of unresolved SIDS. Confine that data, move it somewhere else, give it to your legal team. Is it subject to legal hold? If it's not, do you even need it? Go through that process. Do you have a delete policy where you can get rid of this data and not migrate it? And then we talk about budget optimization. Discovery tools also, a lot of them have the ability to really narrow down what's important. And there are a few out there that actually let you archive right away after you discover the data based on rules. So why don't you take your budget that you had originally, archive or tier the data that you're not required to keep on that high performance storage, and reinvest it. Buy a higher performance storage. Buy something else that will make your users happy when you have bad code. Everyone knows that it's cheaper. Not everyone knows, but everyone thinks it's cheaper to go out and buy a higher performance storage than actually fix the code. So give them that. If you're going to a cloud provider, know before you go, know what data sets are important to you. Do they even need to be there? Or can you put them in an object-based data store that they're just going to sit there? And then even inside your object-based tiers, you have the ability to tier within those even further to almost make them ice cold.
Yeah.
So, and then beyond that, once you actually have an effective plan in place, you're not only reducing your prime time storage spend, but you're also reducing your replicated side. If you're using replication, you're reducing your data protection spends. So now other teams are getting involved, and you're reducing their budgets too.
So, Jay, this is yeah, I'm sorry, man. This is a tremendous opportunity to kind of do things better and change the way you've been operating.
Exactly. And it's just simply doing data discovery. Maybe you don't do all of these. Maybe you just do one of them. Maybe you have better knowledge of your data, but it gives you optionality in the future.
That makes great sense. Cool. So next, come on, click. Here we go. So yeah, I'm actually getting a little network warning here. My network's slow, so I hope I sound okay. So testing is absolutely critical.
We just have to go back one here. I think we skipped the topology.
I skipped one?
Yep.
Thanks,
awesome.
Ben.
All right. So
perfect.
Again, back on track here. Topology. Know your topology. What are you doing? Are you going and migrating in the same site? Are you migrating between regions or states, between countries? Are you going on-prem to the cloud, cloud to cloud? Are you going cloud to back on-prem again? So define your path. And once you define your path, understand it. Understand what you have there for bandwidth. You might have a 10 gig link between your core data center and, let's say, your cloud vendor. But what is your latency? Do you have 5 milliseconds of latency? Do you have 100 milliseconds of latency? Because that combined is really going to help drive what your bandwidth is. Do you have any kind of intrusion detection, intrusion prevention in the way? Security teams are going to do what they're required to do, and you might do some migrations and find out, hey, these are moving really good, and all of a sudden, 2 weeks later, there's a bottleneck, and no one really knows what's going on. We'll talk about some ways to mitigate that. Firewall rules. Make sure that those are set before you migrate. Make sure the ports are open. If you can only open the ports in one direction, make sure they are the right direction. Antivirus. Antivirus is notorious for getting in the way of migrations and creating bottlenecks. And so are WAN accelerators. I've had some horror stories with WAN accelerators. There's one vendor out there that attempted to do a read ahead in a migration. So it thought it knew what it needed to read ahead and cache for the migration, which it didn't. But what it was also doing is it was changing the A times on all my files, making it look like everything was just read, because technically the WAN accelerator was reading it because it was caching it. Now you have that going on, which was compounded by a bug in the WAN accelerator code that was forcing all connections back to SMB1. Wow. So I was trying to move data with SMB3, super efficient, super fast, but everything was being pushed back to SMB1, super chatty, super low speed, and not very secure. So really, it was just a checkbox that was included in the code that the vendor set to default on rather than default off. And they did it twice. So they didn't learn from the first mistake. They got hit with it again. but it's something that we always look for in the future. Mark it up as a lessons learned.
Yeah, I think it's really counterintuitive. Most people, I'm sure, say, "Hey, WAN accelerators make things faster," and I think this goes back to your point about communication, right? All of these things in this left-hand column were essentially built for normal day-to-day operations, right? They weren't built to I'm moving all my data, right? And that's where you hit those bottlenecks. I think that's again comes back to this is a team sport, right? You've got to communicate. You need to talk with your security people. And I know in the past, like sometimes there's been kind of hesitancy or, within companies where, the storage guys don't want to talk to the network guys, don't want to talk to the security team. It's critical to tear these barriers down when there's a big migration.
Loop them in, make them a stakeholder, and
Absolutely.
one of a famous saying that's out there is trust but verify. Trust what
Yep.
they're saying, but verifying. And that's actually a great segue into our next slide here.
All right.
Test,
Single
test, and
click.
test. I have it listed here 3 times. Test your sources and targets. Do you have overloaded nodes, or do you have overloaded clusters that are just getting beat up by your clients, and that's why you're moving away from them? If you're using a tool that's enterprise grade or enterprise ready, you're going to have the ability to throttle. So throw a throttle in there. Don't have it fall over during a migration. Misconfigurations. I can't tell you how many times new storage has been installed and you're working through a managed service provider, or you're working through a third party, or you're working through the vendor who's farming that out. Their goal is to get in, get out. They missed something in the configuration. Double check the configuration. Make sure that your LICP port channeling is set up correct. Make sure that the plugs are where they belong. Work with your team to actually do a pull the plug test. Make sure it's all configured correctly before you get into a migration and realize it's not, and then you have to redo that migration. Undersized configurations. I talked about antivirus earlier. Antivirus notoriously is undersized for an environment for a migration. It might be set up for your users in day-to-day use, but once you start moving thousands of files at high speeds, those antivirus configurations might not be sized or scale appropriately. So work with the right teams. Consider turning them off. Consider whitelisting source and destination IP addresses. There's many ways to deal with it. And you can even reconfigure the way the antivirus scanning is done so that maybe it only does it on read, or it only does it on close. It doesn't do it on every single file operation. There's technology limitations out there on the sources and targets.
Right.
There's one technology I know specifically that once you approach 1 million files in any one single directory, you could have an entire directory structure with hundreds of millions of files. But if one of those directories has close to or over 1 million files, the node that's serving that data will suffer immensely. And it won't just take down your connection, but it'll take down everyone else around you. So now you're going to have all these complaints saying, why is my data slow? Why is my financial application slow? I have an outage. There's another vendor out there that doesn't handle short naming convention very well, where every time it writes a file, it'll write the file with its current name, but it will also write the 8.3 name along with it. Now, what if I have another file in that directory that uses an 8.3 name that happens to be the same name that that technology vendor used? So guess what? You might overwrite that file.
Wow.
So you have to look for enterprise tools that can deal with some of this stuff. Long path names. A lot of times you'll have users on the Windows side that will mount a share where it's share / folder 1, folder 2, folder 3, folder 4, folder 5, and then they'll mount that as drive W on their workstation, and then they'll build 50 more folders beyond that. And they're not naming it 1 or 2 characters. They're naming each one of those folders 20 some odd characters long. So now you've exceeded the 260 character limitation. How do you deal with that? Unicode versus non-Unicode. Where are you migrating your data? Are you going between regions that have different character maps? Can both the source and target deal with those different character maps? Test your topology. Simple tools. Just ping, NS lookups, trace routes. If anybody who has children knows, like the child's favorite game is, what is this? Yeah. Play that with your network team. Hey, look, here's my trace route. I've got these 15 things that are here. I've got these 5 things here. I've got these 2 things here. What are they? And then save that. And then use it later on if you have a bottleneck. See if there's anything new in the situation. Did the security team put an appliance in there? I've been in a situation where I had a 10 gig pipe between my source and target. Then all of a sudden, my migration just took a nosedive. We did a trace route. Hey, what is this? It was a security appliance. The security appliance only had a 1 gig connection. So this 10 gig circuit was funneled by a 1 gig appliance. Right. What did we do? Well, we were able to put in an exception for us to go around that. iPerf. Use that. Don't necessarily look at it to base the performance of your storage, but look at it to figure out how long does it take me to move data across the wire. And Wireshark, it's not just for experts. You can do a simple Wireshark trace, and it can show you, are you having tons of network drops, retransmits? That is usually antivirus or security software quarantining or throwing away packets. So look for that stuff. If you want to get even more in depth, then you can take that Wireshark trace that you have because you're having issues and hand it off to your network team, hand it off to your expert to say, hey, what's happening here? And then finally, test your migrations, ask for early adopters, offer incentives. So that way you know what you're going to run into when you get further along in the migration plan.
That makes good sense. And it makes it, again, a little plug for Komprise. We have what we call the iterative error log, right? That really helps you identify a lot of these problems as you begin the tests. So I found that to be really valuable. And again, that's why I think a lot of, enterprise professional services teams choose to use Komprise for these types of jobs because of the experience and the way we make these things easier. So I think it's a great point.
And you've naturally built another segue into our next slide.
Great.
So free tools versus enterprise solutions, free tools, free, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It might be free to go download it, but how much time are you spending in scripting and that manual effort to schedule these jobs? What are you using? Are you using Cron? Are you using a Microsoft schedule? Is it really going to be reliable? Well, a lot of those are single user focused. So what if you or the person that's scheduling these things is no longer available for the cutover or for the iterations? What if the connection is lost? DRS from VMware, it's a great utility within VMware, but it's designed to move my VMs around based on performance, or if there's an outage on an ESXi host. But guess what? When that moves a VM, there's a network blip. A lot of the free tools won't handle that. Most tools in general won't. So what do? Is there a retry built in? Is there any way to cope with that? We talked about the free tools as far as doing SMB to SMB or NFS to NFS, but what about object? What if I have to do object to object, or what if I have to do SMB to object? I talked about limited error checking and validation. This is a really good one. This is the question that came up earlier is I'm in a regulated environment. What do I do? Oh, a great way to prove you did what you said you were going to do is MD5 checksums and audit logs. Do the free tools do that? Do they only do it on a portion of the data? Do they do it on all of the data? A lot of the regulations say I need to not just see a sampling, but prove every file was checked.
Right.
TCP versus UDP. There are some tools out there that will still use UDP. Well, guess what? UDP can be fast, but you won't have the error checking. You won't have the ability for validation. You don't even know if the data got there. So, let's really get over to the enterprise solutions. Enterprise solutions typically have centralized configuration and management. They have the ability to tier or archive. They are multi-user focused. They enable throttling, auditing, verification. There's automation automatically built in, reporting, and the big one, supportability. They can be supported.
A good question. So that's the other point, that reporting part is critical. So we've got a question about could Komprise's audit log be used for chain of custody type issues?
It really depends on your organization, but in my experience, yes, I have been able to use that in the past. But it would be a broader conversation with your legal and compliance teams. And like I said, in my use cases, they were more than satisfied with it.
Because you're showing that MD5 for every file transfer.
Correct.
That makes sense. Great. Good question. Again, please ask questions. It's a great opportunity. Next slide, question. So, all right.
And your communications plan. So the last one here is create one simplified template from operations through leadership. Communicate early and often, be brief and be detailed at the same time. Utilize the subject line for key details. Migration wave number 2 or migration event number 2. Use a simple traffic light as an example. Green, everything's good. Yellow, a few speed bumps here, something's going on. Red, guess what? We might be rolling back. But use the subject line, get people's attention so they actually have something to look at. They can just pop open their phone and say, okay, green, I don't have to look at anything. Yellow, I'm okay for now. But it's been now 2 yellow responses. All right, let me dig in here and see what's going on. Then utilize the body of the communication. Same thing, reiterate the status. Quick, status equals green. Give 1 or 2 sentences, no more, of what's going on. But also, if you're in a situation where there are issues, don't just use that quick statement to rant. Provide a mitigation strategy. What are you doing actively to remediate the situation? And provide a path for support. No one wants to get increased help desk tickets. No one wants their phone ringing off the hook. Provide a path for everyone involved in that migration event to get support. Like, hey, this is what's going on. This is the start. This is the end. And this is anything we anticipate in the process.
Right.
And lastly, don't forget, celebrate the wins. Far too often we get so sunk into these migrations where we forget to actually celebrate, like, hey, that last wave was awesome. It was super quick, or we had an issue, but we dealt with it. Celebrate the wins, call out the individuals that made a difference, and just make everyone feel included.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's going to encourage more people to want to migrate. And then, like you say, like, if the network team addressed a problem, maybe it kind of was their fault, but now turn it into a positive, right? They fixed this, they got us going faster, and you're going to get their support on the next one. It's going to be that much better. Great point.
Yeah, no one wants to hear the negative; they want to hear the positive. So it's not a blame game. It's like, hey, help me win, and let's acknowledge it together.
That's a great point. Cool. Well, so I want to talk about some next steps here. Again, all of this content is going to be on komprise.com/webinar. And again, we talk about taking that analytics approach. I encourage you to register for our next webinar. So again, our co-founder and COO Krishna will be on to talk about cloud native access. This is going to be the ability that when you move your data to the cloud, that it's there in native format to prevent you from having any vendor lock-in. So Ben, I think this was a fantastic conversation. Again, you're one of the people that I always lean on when I have a question. So, thank you so much for joining me today, Ben.
And thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you for participating. Yes, this will be available later on. Please share it. And again, thank you for listening today. We'll talk to you all soon.